Behind the beautiful facades of Victorian England mansions lurked extremely unsavory affairs. Both children and their mothers were utterly powerless at that time. It was believed that if you loved a child, you were simply obligated to beat them with a rod. How did it come to pass that in such an enlightened England, corporal punishment in schools was only abolished in the early 21st century? What shocks you about the real-life photos of Alice's Wonderland prototype? How did a priest from one of the English schools in the Victorian era stand out? And did Charlotte Bronte, the author of Jane Eyre, really endure all the horrors that befell her protagonist? So, let me introduce you. Before you stands little Charlotte Bronte, the future writer and author of that very novel, Jane Eyre. In 1824, she was only 8 years old when her father, the pastor Patrick Bronte, sent her and her 3 sisters to a school for the daughters of poor clergy. Maria, the eldest, was 10, Elizabeth was 9, and the youngest, Emily, was only 6 years old. Her father chose this school because he couldn't afford a governess or a more expensive school. When a crying Charlotte entered Cowan Bridge, hell began for her. It was Cowan Bridge that became the prototype of the grim Lowood institution from the novel Jane Eyre, where the teacher Miss Scatcherd tormented Helen Burns so. In the Victorian era, the main educational principle was the saying of King Solomon's Proverbs. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. Can you imagine? As a result, helpless children were literally abused. In working-class families, children were beaten with fists. The middle class preferred respectable beatings. Do you, too, feel a chilling horror at the thought of such upbringing? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's support each other. And do you know why children are traditionally beaten on the buttocks? It's all part of the harsh English upbringing. They were not lightly beaten, and they even feared breaking growing bones or injuring the head due to strong blows. And if you think that only poor children were abused, you are mistaken. In elite educational institutions, they were beaten even harder than in ordinary ones. For example, canes were a real symbol of Eton College, where endless bullying was practiced both by teachers over students and by senior students over juniors. When in 1911 the headmaster decided to ban canes and replace them with switches, there was an outcry among former students. They all cried out that the English education system was about to collapse because of this. I would really like to know what drove them at that moment. Was it resentment, anger, or did they really believe it was for the best? Now imagine what was happening at Christ's Hospital School in London if it was considered a hell on earth compared to Eton. A scandal erupted when in 1877 a 12-year-old student hanged himself, unable to bear the abuse. An investigation began, and it was found that the teachers paid no attention to the children. All power was in the hands of prefects among the senior students. And as a result, such hazing developed there that one of the students simply couldn't cope. Do you think the school was closed after that? No. A doctor declared it suicide due to temporary insanity. And the school's rules remained unchanged. In state schools in Britain, corporal punishment was only banned in 1987, and in private ones, even more recently. In England, it was in 1999, and in Northern Ireland, in 2003. So think about it when you complain about today's schools. Although perhaps you have good reasons for it. Of course, girls in English schools in the 19th century were beaten much less often than boys. At least girls from the middle and upper classes. In orphanages and schools for the poor, of course, the situation was terrible. For example, in 1896, correctional schools for girls used canes, switches, and strap beatings. Girls were beaten on the hands or shoulders. Discipline, discipline, and discipline again. That was the only thing that mattered to a schoolgirl. Even the slightest transgression was harshly punished. The number of strikes received depended on the offense and was recorded in a special journal next to the student's name. Most often, they were beaten on the palms. Boys could also be spanked on the buttocks, while girls might be struck on their bare legs. For underachievers, they devised a humiliating punishment, the dunce cap, in which those who couldn't keep up with the curriculum were made to wear all day, or simply attached the word dunce to their clothing. Another popular punishment was to rewrite the same sentence 100 times in a row without a single mistake. In case of the slightest error, everything had to be started over. But why go far? I remember well how many times I had to rewrite the same thing. But perhaps that wasn't as terrifying as the canings in English schools. You may ask, how could mothers agree to such treatment of their own children? The thing is, children and women were the most powerless people in Victorian England. A child born in wedlock essentially belonged to the father. Only the mother was responsible for an illegitimate child. In case of divorce or separation, the child stayed with the father or a guardian appointed by the father. Mothers were allowed only rare visits. Heart-wrenching scenes accompanied the separation of mothers and children. A married woman had no right to dispose of even her own earnings. A husband could go to his wife's employer and demand that her salary be given to him. That's what the husband of actress Julia Glover did, who first abandoned her with their babies in her arms, and when she became famous, claimed her earnings. And they started paying her salary to him. In another case, a woman who ran a successful studio and supported her husband found out after his death that he had bequeathed all her property to his illegitimate children. The wife was left in poverty. These were quite common stories. At the same time, in the Victorian era, there was no doubt an active and strong working girl would give birth to weak and sickly children. Allegedly, a working mother, focused on her career, would spend all her energy on it, leaving nothing for the children. Therefore, Victorian society believed that it was better for a working girl never to become a mother. Society also condemned when girls with external defects became mothers. For example, God forbid, freckles. Freckles in Victorian England were a reason to urge such individuals not to reproduce. Horrible. It's a good thing they weren't really listened to. What do you think about that? It would be very interesting to know. If you got pregnant, you stayed at home and said, "Hans in the cellar." A real Victorian lady under the threat of the death penalty couldn't tell her friends she was pregnant. This word was taboo. So girls came up with various decent ways to announce their condition. Talking about a stork had long been tiresome, and unexpected verbal turns became fashionable, like sprained ankle or Hans in the cellar. But of course, that was a last resort if you still had to leave home and demonstrate to everyone your sin with your own husband. Let me quote Teresa O'Neill, "Yes, you shine with happiness, but you also represent a grotesque reminder of base animal instincts and the urge to reproduce, from which people cannot refrain. Just look at yourself from the outside. You're swaying from foot to foot like a goose. A walking billboard for sexual permissiveness. Absolutely dreadful. No, go home." Our little Charlotte was told by her older sisters, who arrived earlier, that the rules at Cowan Bridge School were extremely harsh. Any minor infraction was met with public beatings for the girls. If a pupil left even one crease on a made bed, she could be forced to wear a humiliating sign reading slovenly. Beatings and constant humiliations were part of the educational process. Actual education for girls was very conditional. Primarily, it was rote learning of the catechism. After all, in those days, it was extremely improper for a young lady to demonstrate intelligence or knowledge in public. All this had to be carefully hidden by a lady. because doing otherwise could ruin her reputation forever and put an end to her chances of marriage. Interestingly, similar behavior is often observed in modern society. Even in the early 19th century, it was believed that women had no real intelligence and were incapable of thinking about anything other than new dresses and housekeeping. Mathematics was only needed to the extent that a future head of household could manage household expenses. Dancing and good manners were what really mattered to get married or secure a position as a governess in a good household. They taught spelling, history, grammar, embroidery, and housekeeping, of course. Music, foreign languages, and drawing were paid for separately by the parents. Even for girls raised at home, it wasn't necessarily easier. Children were beaten by both parents and governesses, and scandals periodically erupted about the cruelty of the latter. The biggest scandal was on the eve of the 20th century in 1889. Although compared to others, the Alice from Wonderland was probably lucky. Her prototype was Alice Liddell. Her father was the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University and the Dean of Christ Church College. Therefore, the girl's education was extremely diverse. She was taught to draw by John Ruskin himself, a famous artist at the time. And the mathematics teacher, a staff member of the same college, Charles Dodgson, who went down in history as Lewis Carroll, spent a lot of time with her and took many photographs of her. Alice was 7 when they met. Books about her became literary masterpieces, and she became one of the symbols of Britain. But it wasn't as rosy as it might seem at first glance. When the girl turned 15, she confessed that these semi-nude photo shoots had been a strong trauma for her. She felt intense shame and couldn't confide in anyone. When Lewis Carroll found out about this confession, he was deeply shaken. He wrote letters to Alice, but her mother categorically cut off all contact and burned all previous correspondence. Carroll remained unmarried for life. Interestingly, many years later, when Alice asked him to be the godfather of her third son, Carroll refused. But why did Alice do this? Perhaps she fell victim to Stockholm Syndrome? Such is the unique home upbringing. Charlotte suffered most from the perpetually exhausting hunger. At Cowan Bridge, the pupils were given very little food, which was also not fresh and contaminated. Because of this, there was once an epidemic of typhoid among the girls. Victorian England schools were nothing more than a business that demanded profit at any cost. The father of the Bronte sisters paid £14 per year for each girl. Of course, this did not cover the expenses of maintaining the girls. Such schools inevitably had their philanthropists. But the directors tried to save on everything, primarily on food. This motivated parents to send parcels with provisions. Cowan Bridge was headed by wealthy clergyman William Carus Wilson. Charlotte Bronte's biographer does everything to justify him, blaming the staff for everything. Nevertheless, the fact remains that poor girls were forced to eat burnt porridge, wash it down with sour milk, and eat rotten meat. The cooks at Cowan Bridge would fetch rotten water from the rain barrel, and the fat was always rancid. For the starving girls, a real feast was a pie made from potato peelings and bits of meat. The conditions at Cowan Bridge were dreadful, and many pupils fell ill with fatal diseases. Here's how a traveler and ethnographer, Sir Richard Francis Burton, described the food at an English school. Breakfast at 8 o'clock consisted of skimmed milk with water in chipped mugs with broken handles. Boys were allowed to bring tea from home. However, there was a constant battle for the right to drink it. Next were slices of bread, lightly spread with butter. Gourmets usually collected all the butter on one edge of the slice to enjoy the last piece. How's that for breakfast? Degrading, if you ask me. Lunch was at 1 o'clock, starting with pudding, usually made from scraps of stale bread with lard or fat. It reliably killed the appetite, according to the students. Lunch ended with meat, as in all second-rate schools. The meat was incredibly poorly prepared. Burnt on the outside, blue, sinewy, and cartilaginous inside. Potatoes resembling shrapnel and detested carrots were served as vegetables. Dinner was a repeat of breakfast. And at the age when boys are growing rapidly, they always went to bed hungry. Sometimes the roommates would chip in to buy a loaf of bread, ham, pork sausage, or sausages, and sometimes even beer and wine. So the feasts usually ended in fights. Saturday was dreaded by all, as on this day they served a special pie made from all the week's leftovers and scraps. And this gloom persisted throughout the year. In 1853, a graduate of another English private school recalled a dish that the children called corpse pie and which was served for lunch every Monday. It was a horrible pie with a stone-like crust that didn't break but peeled off in layers, and inside were dreadful lumps of cartilage and pieces of tendons interspersed with layers of fat. Today's school children would shudder in horror. And if that's not enough for you, add this fact. Children were given beer to drink. Yes, that was also a common practice. It was believed that beer was good for children. Charles Dickens writes in his story about a schoolboy, another of our boys went home to his parents quite ill. I heard the doctor telling his father that he could not understand why the child was sick. Perhaps only because he drank beer, which they gave at school. By the way, it was believed back then that children shouldn't be fed much. So at home, the Bronte sisters only ate potatoes for dinner, and they weren't given any meat at all, although their father could afford it all. The same was true in all other families. But at home, everything was fresh. Even in the wealthiest households, children were only given bread and milk for breakfast, and after 5 o'clock, children were not supposed to have any food at all. Governesses strictly enforced this. Charlotte and her sisters had just recovered from measles before coming to school and had not fully recovered. And here, the girls faced eternal cold. There was nowhere to get warm. The bedroom was always extremely cool, and the icy stone floor didn't help either. The classrooms were always chilly. And if you add poor nutrition to such living conditions, it's not surprising that the children simply couldn't cope even with minor illnesses on their own. Overall, it must be said that English girls in the Victorian era were toughened even more than boys. In addition, every Sunday, all the pupils had to walk 3 kilometers to the church, where their headmaster, Mr. Wilson, preached. Walking 3 kilometers in any weather, which is not uncommon in England, was not easy for the perpetually hungry, sickly girls. Classes in Victorian England's poorer schools were disproportionately large. In large cities, class sizes reached up to 100 students in one class. In public schools, they didn't write on paper but on special slates resembling today's chalkboards. And the little ones would write their first numbers with sticks in the sand in special trays. Only in the very senior classes did students receive ink and paper. Teachers also strictly monitored the posture of the pupils. They had to wear special corsets and even a metal collar to support their chin. By the way, future Queen Victoria had spikes sewn into the collar of her dress. It was believed that in special closed schools, they tortured the pupils, developing the most delicate waists in them. Poor girls were even made to sleep in corsets, gradually tightening them more and reducing their waist to 30 centimeters. In 1867, a letter from a girl who attended such a London school for noble girls was published in one of the English ladies' magazines, where every month they tightened their waists by 3 centimeters. It's hard to imagine what health problems the poor girls experienced after such manipulations in the name of beauty. For little Charlotte Bronte, what happened at Cowan Bridge School became a huge shock for life. At that time, the most severe demands were placed on girls. They were only allowed to be perfection itself. In all other cases, a girl was already considered wild and therefore practically fallen. The clouds quickly darkened over the eldest of the Bronte sisters, Maria. The girl took care of the younger ones and looked after them, was very kind and hardworking. It is not known why one of the teachers, who became the prototype of Miss Scatcherd, took a dislike to Maria. Maria was subjected to endless nitpicking and countless punishments. As a result, she fell seriously ill. One day, the girl, barely summoning her strength, barely got out of bed in the morning, only out of fear of the strict teacher. And the teacher threw her to the floor and scolded her for laziness. The girl reluctantly got dressed, went to class, where she was again severely punished for being late. Soon she became so weak that the teachers had to inform her father of everything, who took Maria home, where she soon died of tuberculosis. And just a month later, Elizabeth, who was a year younger than her, died. Then the father realized what was happening and took the younger girls, Charlotte and Emily, from the deadly school. Charlotte continued her education at home with the help of books from her father's library, and this method yielded the best results. She grew up to become a renowned writer, pouring all her childhood nightmares into the book Jane Eyre, where she described what it was like to study at an English boarding school. We hope that such harsh methods of education will remain in the past. If you found this interesting, leave a like, write comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new informative videos. See you later.